Katie LaFalcia. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot, video 2 of Dorothy Kilgallen, The Incredible Life and Mysterious Death. We're going to just continue here on to Chapter 4, Communication, Marvel of the Age. So she was a household name. She was praised by Damon Runyon. Now, Damon Runyon, for anybody who doesn't recognize the name, was a writer of short stories. He was famous for his short stories about the underbelly of life in New York City, upon which they based Guys and Dolls. Nathan Detroit, Nicely Johnson. Great stories, and done in the vernacular, so they used the slang and the tone of the language of New York City at that time. Very great books. She was praised by Time magazine. The New York Post called her the communication marvel of the age. She had an unerring instinct for news. She lived and breathed the newspaper business. She extolled the morning paper, how important it was. She was very, very unique because she was a celebrity reporter who did hard news. She championed the blacklist of the, the Un-American Committee, the House Un-American Acts Committee, which really ruined the career of an awful lot of people in the entertainment business. She was a fashion icon. She was on best dressed lists all over the place. They gave her the title of having Scarlett O'Hara quality, which would be kind of a backhanded compliment today, I think. In 1955, she was one of the 10 best tailored women. Interesting award from the Custom Tailors Guild of America. Once she was friends with Frank Sinatra, but they had an ongoing public feud, and it was brutal, the things they said about each other. She wasn't impressed by him, is what got it started in her column. I'm just not really all that impressed by Frank Sinatra. She did a 6-part series about his hedonism and debauchery and his swollen ego. She called him a little skinny, sallow fellow. In 1956, she said he was a modern version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that he had clothes from, his clothes were from a Broadway haberdasher. I guess that was an insult of some sort. And she accused him of abandoning his wife. He was okay as a father, but he abandoned his wife. And she listed the many women he was associated with. Let's see what she said here. She highlighted the many women that he bedded, such as Anita Ekberg, Lana Turner, Marlene Dietrich, Gloria Vanderbilt, Marilyn Maxwell, and a bevy of lesser-known beauties. She wrote, many more, of course, have been the fluffy little struggling dolls of show business, pretty and small-waisted and similar under the standard layer of peach-colored pancake makeup. Starlets who never got to first base in Hollywood, assorted models and vocalists and chorus girls now lost in the ghosts of floor shows past. Others belong to the classification most gently described as tawdry. At the end, she said it took Ava Gardner, the volcano in female form, to really make him lose his head as thoroughly as a man has ever done without benefit of guillotine. Hilarious. He had a turbulent relationship with Ava Gardner, and Dorothy Kilgallen said Ava Gardner goes for men like Sinatra goes for women. He sent her a tombstone with her name on it and called her the chinless wonder in Las Vegas in his show. He passed her in a club, and she was wearing dark glasses. He walked past and dropped $1 in her cup and said, "I always figured she was blind." So I told you it was brutal. She put his womanizing and mob ties and Rat Pack nonsense in her column. He was obsessed with hatred for her. She was sent to cover the Grace Kelly wedding, and she had 11 pieces of luggage that she took with her. In her column, she wrote about Rainier's other love interests, Rainier, I'm not quite sure, potato, about his other love interests. I never knew about that. Apparently, he wasn't the devoted husband everybody liked to pretend he was, and said that Marilyn Monroe had turned him down, and she arranged a meeting at a party. Kilgallen arranged a meeting at a party to get to know him. His true love, apparently, was a French actress, Giselle Pascal. And Kilgallen said his wedding to Grace was haunted by the ghost of the girl who was very much alive. He couldn't marry her. Rainier's own priest let it slip that this woman was a commoner and French, and French commoners were not allowed to be citizens of Monaco, and therefore he couldn't marry her. Dorothy was criticized by the clergy in a letter that was published instead of her column in the Philadelphia Daily News. Grace Kelly, her family was a prominent Roman Catholic family in Philadelphia, a lot of money. And the Catholic Church in Philadelphia had a lot to say about Dorothy Kilgallen's description of this relationship. The priest wrote that Dorothy Kilgallen was vitriolic, to annihilate the character of a fellow human, to set herself up as judge and jury, and wild, scandalous humor. Her humor was sophomoric. She has a Lilliputian mind. In June of 1956, her 14-year-old son went missing. There was a 14-state all-points bulletin put out, and he returned home late the next day, the story of which has never to this day been told. She faced criticism, snark, of two male columnists. Let's see what they said. About the disappearance of her son, temporary disappearance of her son. In 1957, there was the Billy Graham Crusade at Madison Square Garden, and there was a crowd of 200,000 outside the garden in Times Square because the Madison Square Garden arena was full. 200,000 people in the streets. Kilgallen called him profoundly earnest. To him, heaven is as real as Chicago. She accepted the invitation from him and from his wife to go to their North Carolina home. She was a staunch Catholic. She was concerned with the moral issues of the day, and I wrote in the margins here, really? What about Ray? Johnny Ray. His Madison Square Garden crusade brought crowds to Richard's nearby supper club, and they were very grateful, she and her husband. This is really weird. In his house, Graham had a collection of 200 pairs of hands, like famous people's hands in different materials, like models, sculptures of their hands. He had one of Anne Boleyn's hands that were used to hold the rings of the Queen that belonged to Anne Boleyn. All this time, Kilgallen was still dating Johnny Ray. So the Queen and Philip came to North America and to the United States, and on their tour, they had 95 suitcases. Dorothy covered it all dressed up. She was totally struck by the royals. Hearst told her he got her a chauffeur in a $24,982 Rolls Royce. This price today, get ready for this. This is just to go to the motorcade of Queen Elizabeth in New York City, it would have cost her $271,253 today. And somehow or other, Dorothy Kilgallen ended up in the motorcade, 3 cars behind the Queen, and people were waving at her. She was waving at the crowd, and her press agent said, "Now I have seen everything." There goes the Queen, covering the Queen. So and her articles about it gushed. She went to the London debut of My Fair Lady and gushed about that. She called Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher and Liz Taylor's scandal a tragic comment on current morality. This is very interesting. Chapter 5, A Growing List of Enemies. Kilgallen became much more vocal in writing about dictators. She wrote against Trujillo, Somoza, Castro. She interviewed Cuban exiles in Miami, and some believe she developed sources with them. Castro and his pals actually were featured on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1959. I did not know this. Sullivan called them a wonderful group of revolutionary youngsters. And he compared Castro to George Washington. I have a friend who often says, I better not say that because of this one word in the sentence might trigger the algorithm, but I'll substitute. One man's freedom fighter is another man's person who causes distress to another country with random acts of violence, if you get my drift. Anyway, Castro was mobbed by fans. He was kind of thought of as a modern Robin Hood. Kilgallen was against Castro immediately. She called him a communist and a killer. Russia had bases in Cuba and had Russian pilots in Havana. So she reported on this. She had a feud with Jack Parr because she called out his pro-Castro sympathies. She still was feuding with Sinatra. She loved to make fun of his spats with Sammy Davis. Sinatra fell out with everybody. He had been friends with Sammy Davis. She ridiculed Mrs. Khrushchev's clothes. I mean, Nikita Khrushchev was the big shot in Russia, and he was actually kind of from a poor country family. He was often called the peasant. His wife was even less urbane. And, she was short and dumpy, and she wore her Soviet outfits, not knowing that, there was a world of fashion out there. And Dorothy talked about the grisliness of her attire. She says it fits like a slipcover, her clothes. She says she's seen job applicants for laundry and maid and cook who were dressed better. She's pretty brutal. The FBI kept an open file on her and reported to Hoover that she and Richard had their own lives. So here's the story, and this is according to the FBI. Richard was bi. He had his own apartment. I believe it was somewhere in New Jersey, and he would keep partners there for protracted periods of time. And yet every day they were doing this radio program as this devoted married couple, and they had children. They were devoted to each other. That's the thing. It's very interesting. She had this bi boyfriend. He had a bi life, and yet they put on this veneer because the times. That's the way it was. Johnny Ray got arrested for indecent proposals to a male cop. She couldn't do anything to help him. And friends reported long after that these two were very happy together. They had a really amicable, smooth relationship, other than, whatever else they were up to. They didn't fight. They agreed about everything. They enjoyed each other's company, and they really liked each other as people. Kilgallen was sued by the Washington Press Corps. The Washington Press Corps of Women, for insinuating about sexual exploits on trips with staffers. And after years, she won the suit. It dragged on forever. She won because she didn't mention names and there was no proof of malice. This is called a blind item. And so you might think you know the people she was talking about, but she never mentioned names. Richard, her husband, in 1960 opened a supper club in New Jersey called the Paris in the Sky, and it was real fancy. In February of 1960, she got her star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and there were many famous witnesses happy to talk about Dorothy's relationship with Ray. This was not secret. Steve Rossi, the comedian, introduced them when they first met, and he said they were madly in love. According to Rossi, her husband was gay, and she had a lover, and he had a lover and an apartment in New Jersey, and it was an arrangement that satisfied everybody involved. Ray was bisexual, but had never really had a permanent relationship after he met Dorothy. He and Dorothy were considered a wild, mad love affair that went on for a very long time. In the 60s, she was sent to Los Angeles to cover the murder of Barbara Finch by her husband and his girlfriend. Not familiar with this case. The first trial ended in a mistrial. Time magazine said Kilgallen had the best coverage. Newsweek said that Kilgallen was the star attraction at the trial. The second trial was a mistrial, and they had a third trial. He got first-degree murder and got life and was paroled and died in 95. She got second-degree murder and was paroled in 69 and changed her name. I don't know what else to tell you about that. February of 1960, Jack Parr stormed off camera. There was a big controversy about his Castro support and Kilgallen's critique of it, her very public critique of it. And he marched off stage on live TV. February 17th, Kilgallen wrote it was a stunt to boost his ratings. She called it elaborately choreographed as an Agnes de Mille ballet. Lots of newspapers went back and forth about it, but because of her columns against Parr and Sinatra, there was uncertainty sometimes because of the stand she took, very vocal. In May of 1960, she went to London to Princess Margaret's wedding to Anthony Armstrong Jones. This was the first televised royal wedding, so I guess we know who to blame. Her fashion was very much praised at this wedding. She wrote a letter to Eisenhower that he was misjudging Khrushchev, that Khrushchev was not a Soviet Cupid doll, was how she put it. He was shrewd and a ruthless bore. And he also said P.S. She also said P.S. to Eisenhower, when you denounced Castro, you were 2 years behind me. She said this to the president. So he suggested that Eisenhower's aides follow her columns to keep up with international politics. She wrote a critique of too much money and resources being spent on security in New York City for Castro and Khrushchev when they visited New York City. She defended her right to write about Broadway and politics. She said knowing Broadway, maybe she was in closer touch with the masses and public opinion and had a right to weigh in about politics. In 61, she was sent to cover Kennedy's inauguration. She wrote the first column on Kennedy, and her column, I can't even believe the title of this. I do believe she was psychic. Her first column that she wrote on Kennedy was entitled, I Keep Thinking About Abraham Lincoln. She went to 2 out of the 5 inaugural balls. At the pre-inaugural gala, someone gave her a drink and she got really, really sick. She wasn't a big drinker, and there was a lot of accusation of her being a drinker, but she wasn't. And we'll talk about that later, how that rumor got started. pretty interesting. Keep in mind, she had a lot of enemies, people who were jealous too, you know. So at the inauguration, she wasn't well, and she had to be hospitalized for pneumonia. She predicted right away that Jackie Kennedy would become a fashion icon. She and Richard then went to Jamaica. She was invited as one out of 10 people that were asked to design a room in a faux house, which is a contest of the New York Design Center in New York City, the National Design Center in New York City. The 10 best dressed rooms of 1961. I tried really hard to find pictures and I could not find them, but she was one of the rooms. In a column, she addressed Kennedy and said, "Do not meet with Castro." She sued the writer Cindy Adams for saying that her marriage was joyless. Adams countersued. The suits were dropped after big money was spent on the lawyers and there was a lot of stress. She was still going hot and heavy with Johnny Ray and was very close to Richard, and Richard in his book said they were in love. They loved each other. Kilgallen was really into the space program. She had a big crush on John Glenn. She mourned the death of Hemingway. They had been friends. She had what they called a weekly science club at P.J. Clark's restaurant and bar to chase away the blues. And she said they hobnobbed with the literary Illuminati, stars, celebrities, mobsters. Chapter 6, A Fatal Column. She was obsessed with Marilyn Monroe. August 3rd of 62, she wrote about Monroe and Robert Kennedy Sr., but she did not name Robert Kennedy Sr. This would be the present third-party candidate's father. The next night, after her column appeared, August 4th, Monroe died. A number of changing and conflicting stories were batted around about Monroe's death. Her doctor and her psychiatrist were associated with the Communist Party, and they came into her life around the time that she began having an affair with John Kennedy. When that affair cooled, she sort of started an affair with Robert Kennedy. Don't ask me, I don't know. Monroe was, she had a publicist who was a woman. And her publicist misled reporters to believe that this was a self-inflicted situation with Monroe. To today, there are many unanswered questions and glaring contradictions. After Monroe's funeral, her publicist partied on Kennedy Lawford's yacht and kept John Kennedy company while Jackie was with her best friend in Italy. Then the publicist became inaccessible in Europe and was lured back by Robert Kennedy Sr. So one of the last people to see Monroe alive, never questioned by the cops. The coroner report said that, quote, Monroe swallowed 64 pills at one time. The autopsy reported no pills in her body. Her blood toxicology result disagreed with this pill thing. The timing of the death and the toxicologist destroyed all of the forensic evidence before, wait a minute. There were questions about the timing of the death, like when did it actually happen, and questions about the toxicology. And all of this information was destroyed, all this forensic evidence, before the medical examiner, Thomas Noguchi, could run any tests. Now, I've written in the margin here, this is all alleged. It's the words of the book, not my words, so let's see what kind of trouble I'm going to get myself into here. Several eyewitnesses, including law enforcement and 2 former Los Angeles mayors, allege that they saw Robert Kennedy Sr. in Los Angeles that day, allegedly, and that he came to her house, Monroe's house, allegedly to confront her about gossip in Dorothy's column, wanting to know how did Dorothy Kilgallen get that information, allegedly. Monroe later that day on the phone said that Robert Kennedy Sr. had manhandled her and threatened her. This is an alleged conversation. And mentioned that a lot of it was about dangerous secrets that she, Monroe, knew about the Kennedys. Allegedly. Monroe had no intention of going public. She knew it would destroy her career. I mean, she knew they were powerful. She was always discreet, always private, and adept with the press. And it's very interesting, this little glimpse of Marilyn Monroe, because she wasn't what she's often stereotyped to be. She was an astute businesswoman. Other people knew a lot about Kennedy's secrets, including Kilgallen, who knew facts about alleged affairs. She told her friends about it. She talked about it, but she would not print it. Fear, power, Kilgallen was so upset by Monroe's death that the paper had to send another reporter to Los Angeles to cover it. They wanted her to go. She couldn't do it. She had to be hospitalized. There's a lot of debate on this, and it was claimed that she was too sick to write her column on August 8th, which was very unusual. The question has been asked numerous times, was she so remorseful, so overwhelmed with guilt that her column might have caused Monroe's death in one way or another, that she was kind of guilty and tortured by the guilt and got sick. In her column on August 9th, she wrote about Monroe and said that her death was an involuntary act of a tortured creature. She speculated in several columns. She mentions Peter Lawford being one of the last to see Monroe, and some papers actually deleted this, papers that were syndicated. August 16th, a week later, Kilgallen claimed it was foul play. Kilgallen claimed this. She questioned the job of and the role of her Monroe's housekeeper and said, if she's a housekeeper, I'm a circus acrobat. She was actually placed by the doctor to keep tabs on Monroe, not to clean the house. Kilgallen asked many questions about Monroe's death and wrote, the real story has not been told. Unreliable sources fed her misinformation, further muddying the case. There's much conspiracy theories about it, and I wrote in brackets, for a later time. This is just too much, and the book covers a lot of it, and let's do one conspiracy at a time. We can do it another time. The LA coroner said that Monroe was not an addict, was not mentally ill, because he had access to her medical records. And her use of pills was light to moderate, like she took a sleeping pill, but she wasn't popping them. Because of Kilgallen's death, that was ascribed to drugs and alcohol, in retrospect, people wanted to call her a functional alcoholic, but there's no evidence of that. Now, why did she have a number of hospital visits? People like to say, make accusations that she was sent to the hospital to dry out or for the DTs or whatever. The reality is she had chronic anemia. She was very frail looking. She had little bird bones. She was tiny. And she had this inherited thing where she was chronically anemic. And it can be quite debilitating. And she had to have regular, periodic blood transfusions. And she'd get so sick, they'd have to hospitalize her. Then they'd beef her up with transfusions, and she'd be good to go for a while. A detective was hired after her death, and he said she did not overuse drugs. That the autopsy showed, this is Kilgallen, the autopsy showed she was in good health. She had no liver damage, like from alcohol or whatever. She struggled with TMJ, that joint in her jaw, and she had mouth ulcers from anemia. She was a light social drinker. She would carry a glass around, but it wasn't alcohol. She was bringing down the defenses of people that she was trying to get information from. Her writing, radio, and TV appearances were so public. She had major scoops. She wrote witty things every single day of the year. She turned out copy daily. She never showed up for television or live radio, incapacitated in any way. She was a good mother. She was very involved with her children. Many people close to her said she rarely drank alcohol, but she was carrying around ice water. Some people made accusations that there were confrontations in the marriage, yes, but there were confrontations in their marriage because sometimes it got a little crowded. But she had severe anemia, and she was hospitalized at one point for a month because she had such anemic blood that it was pink instead of red. She had this condition her whole life. She was afraid to eat and get fat, and this was another one of her problems. She had a little bit of maybe, allegedly an eating disorder, or let's just say disordered eating. July of 1963, her daughter married and eventually became a clothes designer. Her son married in 1962, but she didn't approve of that marriage. Her husband, Richard, was ambitious. Now, he did have a drinking problem, and he once set his bedroom on fire with a cigarette when he kind of passed out with a cigarette. Okay, part 2, chapter 7, the crime of the century. January 26th of 1963, Kilgallen visited Kennedy. They were old friends, actually. She was good friends. She was good friends with Salinger's press secretary, Salinger, the press secretary for Kennedy, and she became good friends with Kennedy. She and her son went to his office in the Oval Office and the White House, and she reported later that, he was so engaging with her son. He was just such a genuinely nice person, charming, of course, but kind to her son, and he didn't need to be a little kid, Kilgallen was a big fan of Kennedy early on, before he was inaugurated, and she defended him often in her column. So here are some things that she wrote about. I'm not alleging anything. I'm not making accusations. I'm not putting forward any conspiracy theories. I'm just telling you what has been written about Kilgallen's opinions. And some of this is based on fact, and some of it is speculation. And we're all smart enough to figure out what's what. Anyway, November 22nd, 1963. It was very unusual that 6 members of the cabinet left together for Japan. And Salinger, too. He would never have allowed the obvious security lapses in Kennedy's motorcade that happened in Dallas. Dallas was a hotbed of reactionary conservatism, and they hated JFK. Adlai Stevenson spat on the police chief. Let me rephrase that. He was spat upon, Adlai Stevenson, for being too liberal. The police chief went on TV and begged Dallas to respect Kennedy. Don't be spitting on the president. And don't give Dallas a bad name internationally. Okay, guys, we're going to be on TV. Let's not make us look bad. There were many credible threats that were made in Chicago, in Tampa, in Miami, including what allegedly happened to Kennedy, who, shooting from the depository. Those sorts of threats were made all over the country as Kennedy traveled around on this junket that he was on. The FBI was aware and alert. JFK had canceled his Chicago visit. Close friends begged him to cancel his trip to Dallas. But he told them that the Secret Service had reassured him that he had 508 people protecting him. In Fort Worth, the day before, 300 local cops, 80 Air Force Base cops, 60 sheriffs, 5 Texas state cops, 32 Secret Service agents, the Fort Worth Fire Department, and the River Oaks Fire Department were all part of the security in Fort Worth. There were police on the exits and stairwells of the hotel. All the doors and windows all along the route of the motorcade in Fort Worth were checked. If you had a building on the street where his car drove by, the entire building was checked. Dallas, on the other hand, was shockingly lax. No windows were monitored. The sheriffs were ordered to not participate in security for the president. There were very few cops evident. The motorcade route was changed at the last minute to zigzag between buildings, slowing it down dramatically and providing an opportunity for crossfire. The route was later described by the Warren Report as the only place in Dallas where a direct rifle shot from a high building was possible. There were more than 8,000 people in the crowd at the airport when Kennedy and Jackie landed. And along the route, there were crowds 30 people deep, 250,000 people along the Dallas route as he drove in a motorcade in an open convertible. This would never be allowed today. The press who were with JFK in Dallas were betting that morning when the shooting would start. I'm quoting the book. This is just what they said, the press. Kennedy picked out Jackie's outfit. He told her, "Show these Texans what good taste really is." 5 minutes. They were 5 minutes from their lunch destination when they reached the place that was so tight that the limousine had to slow almost to a stop to negotiate the turn, Dealey Plaza. It was an ambush situation with possible gunfire from multiple directions, and law enforcement and Secret Service knew it. Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent assigned to Jackie, even left position on the back of the president's limo and got in a car behind 90 seconds before the shots. And we'll talk about that in a minute because that was an interesting moment. So this is an alleged thing. People were allowed on fences and trees and light posts, and a park-like area was kept clear by law enforcement, the grassy knoll, the area from which some shots were alleged to come. The car was going 11.2 miles per hour when the shots were fired. And this is described in the book as a public execution of JFK. In broad daylight, by dark forces, a stain on American history. The democratic choice nullified. A coup, sudden, violent, and unlawful. An unlawful seizure of power from a government. And a cynical cover-up. And this is the operative narrative still. And there's a gross description in the book at this point. I'm editorializing for my own self here. A gross description in the book of his injuries in the limousine, and I'm not going to go there. We all know what happened. So he was taken to Parkland Hospital. LBJ and his wife were put in a secret hospital room. The fear was that he was having a heart attack. He kept clutching his chest. Obvious to all who saw Kennedy, he was dead. But the emergency room staff saw agonal breathing. So this is sort of I don't know how to describe it. It's a result of the nervous system when you're essentially dead, you're dying, and you have what they call chain stroke breathing. You do maybe one long deep breath and then a pause, and then maybe a couple of short breaths and a pause, and then maybe a couple of gasps and a long pause, and the pauses get longer and longer, and then you die. And it's very often an indication in sick people that they're dying, or injured people that they're dying. Now, sometimes you can be brought back from that. Not usually, but sometimes. But the description of the injury to Kennedy's head. Anyway, this agonal breathing, this is the death gasps. They began efforts to help him because you never know, but when you saw his head. And the reason why, and this is so interesting and so controversial, he was lying on a stretcher and they were looking at him this way. There was nothing left back here. They didn't realize it until they rolled him over to examine his back, and they went, oh. So about 14 doctors were in the room. Many had rushed over from the nearby medical school, including a professor of urology and an oral surgery resident. They list all these doctors. What? The president's own doctor was, interestingly enough, stuck on a bus on the way to this luncheon they were headed for and did not know about any of it. He had been relegated to this press bus, which was very unusual, but off he went against his will, and he had to fight to get a hitch a ride back to the hospital. Kennedy had a bullet in his throat, and it was described by a doctor who helped to put the trach tube in that it was an entry wound from the front. And this Dr. Goldstrich, another doctor, agreed, but kept quiet about it publicly because, as he said, and I quote this doctor, "I was afraid. There were so many people who were associated with the assassination who had died by questionable means." He wouldn't talk about it. Finally, Dr. McClelland, a surgeon who had been called over, was shocked to see the extent of the head wound and said, okay, enough is enough. The description is graphic. The wound indicated that it was an exit wound. It was low in the back of his skull. And so the doctors, and this is so interesting, the doctors all agreed the sequence was he was shot in the throat from the front, shot in the back from behind, and that the headshot came from the front and exited at the back. Crenshaw, years later, said that Kennedy was hit twice from the front. Multiple medical witnesses described the wounds that support this. And there's a whole series of witnesses who put together a story that pretty much says that the photos of the autopsy that were made official were doctored. That his wounds were disguised, moved, and rearranged to the point where a funeral home makeup artist guy who was famous for reconstructing was brought in. We'll get into that later. A lot of alleged things here, just very interesting theories. Medical eyewitnesses all disagree with the autopsy photos. This is not what I saw in the emergency room. All of them, all of the medical eyewitnesses, doctors, nurses, orderlies, respiratory therapists, laboratory people, all of them. They said these photos were altered. They do not show what medical personnel saw in the trauma room on November 22nd. Also, some Secret Service agents, some cops who were the motorcade cops, people in the parking lot who saw him being brought in, press people, medical eyewitness, press statements, all these documented people who treated him, were statements on medical files, memos between Parkland medical staff, testimony under oath. It's just really overwhelming documentation of what they saw, as opposed to the final official story. Parkland staff was extremely experienced with severe gunshot traumas. That was the go-to hospital. They're fully skilled to recognize an entry wound, an exit wound, and a trajectory. Very familiar. The Assassination Records Review Board, which was an independent agency, turned up new evidence. Approximately 42 credible witnesses saw a large rear skull wound. This included medical staff, law enforcement, FBI agents, Secret Service agents, morticians, and the public along the motorcade who saw the event. And there's just so much graphic description in here. It's really appalling. The Secret Service agent, Clint, was the only agent who ran to cover the couple at the moment of shooting, and he confirmed the nature of the wounds. There was no front exit wound at all. There was no facial wound at all. An RN said from the front, Kennedy didn't look bad. She came into the room, he was on the stretcher, and she thought, oh, okay, he doesn't look so bad. Then she saw the back of his head, and she's affidavit under oath. But history has been rewritten, allegedly. Dr. Clark stopped the resuscitation, and as he walked by her, he said to Jackie, your husband's dead, and off he went, because, surgeons. It was officially announced at 1:33. The Dallas reporter at the scene rushed the story out. He'd seen the event, and they did a special edition, and he wrote that they saw it happen. He was shot from the front. It came from two places, the grassy knoll and a railroad overpass. Many, many witnesses. So interesting. But the story got pulled because already the officials were pushing the lone assassin theory. Dallas officials went along to avoid rocking the boat of the official story. The Dallas mayor was the brother of the deputy director of the CIA, and this is Allen Dulles, and he had been fired by Kennedy in 1962, and they didn't like Kennedy. Another reporter interviewed two doctors a couple of hours after the assassination. Let's see what they had to say. Now, this book has so many drawings and so many pictures. Where am I here? I'm going to try to paraphrase this. So this is from the Dallas Times Herald. And a couple of hours after the assassination, Connie Kritzberg, a reporter, did a phone interview with two of the doctors who treated Kennedy at Parkland. Dr. Kemp Clark, neurosurgery, and Malcolm Perry. She asked how many wounds were there, and Kemp said there was a gaping wound in the back of the head. Perry said, of the wound I was working on, it was an entrance wound in the neck. And I asked him where it was located, and he said below the Adam's apple, in the midline, in the front of the neck. And 3 times this doctor told her it was an entry wound from the front. So she wrote a simple story 12 inches long and turned it in. The next morning, she was shocked to see that what she had submitted had been changed. She found that there had been a very unprofessional sentence inserted, that a doctor admitted it was possible one wound. Well, I was very upset, called the city desk, talked to the assistant city editor, and said, who changed my story? Who put that sentence in there? And he immediately knew what I was talking about and told her, the FBI. A story could not be printed because there was more than one shot, and that one came from the front. It had to be altered, no matter how crudely, to conform to the official story. There were 3 shots from one place, from one man, from behind, and only one man who committed the murder. That's their story, and they're sticking to it. The editors changed the truth at the behest of ? In the book. The media fed lies and misinformation to the public, allegedly, and there's no way to know without an investigation, but she says we were told who did it and how within an hour and a half of the event. Case closed. A young nurse helped move Kennedy's body from the car to the trauma room and stayed at his head the whole time. After he was declared dead, she washed his hair before he was placed in his coffin. She helped wrap his body in sheets. She confirms the wounds that are described by all these witnesses. No facial wounds, one entry wound in the throat, one exit wound in the back of the head. After the mortuary worker loaded the casket into the hearse, the Secret Service drove off with it alone. But first, before they took it away, they spent an hour alone in a room with his body in a coffin with the door locked and nobody allowed in. They were confronted before they left with the body and said that they were told that state law required a post-mortem before the body could be moved and released to them, that the feds had no jurisdiction in Dallas. And LBJ was notified, and he said, he told the agents, the Secret Service agents, to shoot the doctor if it was necessary to get the body out. Allegedly. And this is an interesting story about LBJ. It says he was not chivalrous. He took over Air Force One immediately, commandeered the bedroom in the plane, leaving Jackie, bloodstained and in shock, to sit with others while LBJ went into what was her bedroom, essentially, on this presidential plane, Air Force One, and he went in to lie down. The Dallas medical examiner was threatened with guns and manhandled to get the body out of the hospital. Dr. Robert Crenshaw, observing all of this later, commented sardonically, quote, "Strange, I thought this president is getting more protection dead than he ever did alive. How brave of these men wearing their Brooks Brothers suits with icons of distinction, the color-coded Secret Service buttons pinned to their lapels, willing to shoot an unarmed doctor to secure a corpse. Dr. Kemp Clark wanted to physically detain the coffin, but the men with guns acted like tough guys with specific orders. A period of many years has neither erased the fear that I felt nor diminished the impression that that incident made upon me." This is one of the doctors at Parkland in the emergency room. In 1992, the medical examiner, Dr. Rose, said that the chain of custody was broken, that he was implying that the body was diverted and that something was done before what became the official autopsy. So this part of the story, let me see how long this is. I don't want to take up too much time. Okay, well, we'll just go until we stop. There is evidence, eyewitness affidavits, that 2 caskets left Dallas. One on Air Force One with no body, and one on a military plane with JFK that was flown directly to a naval facility in D.C. All of this now alleged. All the documents do exist still that say this, and multiple government witnesses saw it. A military casket, which is different from the fancy casket that came out of that Air Force One plane in Washington. The military casket with JFK went to Bethesda. 20 minutes landed before Jackie and the family's fancy casket, empty, arrived. And there was elaborate subterfuge to give time and access to the corpse, which was examined and altered before the formal autopsy. This is the alleged accusation. I'm just repeating what the book says. This is generally agreed upon amongst all the researchers of this event. The bullets had been removed, surgery had been done to conceal the exit and entrance wounds and to make it look like one shooter from behind. Based on the dramatic difference between eyewitness accounts of the medical staff, the public, press, law enforcement, reporters, agents, and other people in Dallas and the official autopsy. So what's not discussed is reports that a Secret Service agent was also killed that day. This is an alleged thing that I've never heard of. Walter Cronkite actually announced it on CBS, and I actually saw the news report, and he does indeed say it. You never see it repeated. ABC and CBS, this was CBS, ABC confirmed it, and it was even repeated by the United Press. But the truth is that it didn't happen. It was deliberate disinformation. So the question that's being asked, and that Dorothy Kilgallen asked, and that many researchers have asked, they had to come up with a story in case somebody saw there were 2 caskets leaving Dallas. Is this how they covered their story? One had Kennedy, one had a shot Secret Service agent. There was no record of a Secret Service agent being shot. But there was eyewitness affidavit after affidavit of 2 caskets leaving on 2 different planes. It's possible to spirit the second casket away. They went to the ground, to the hospital, and checked it out. It was possible. All the Secret Service agents who were at the Trade Mart waiting for Kennedy were sent to the hospital. And this tripled the number of agents that were actually on site at Parkland. Also, because there are plenty of agents to do stuff, also this hospital was segregated. This is something they never talk about. This was segregated. There were areas of the hospital where white people weren't allowed, and areas of the hospital where black people weren't allowed. And there was an ability to move around without being seen because of this segregation. There were alternate non-public exit routes in the hospital. Many staff, patients, ambulances were coming and going. It was chaotic. There is documentation of senior agents in a Washington, D.C. meeting that there was a plane with the body of a Secret Service agent who had been shot. But agents would not be suspicious because decoys are often used for security. So they could concoct a story to cover the fact that there were 2 coffins. There were 2 coffins because they took the body elsewhere. They sent the official casket home empty. Agents might even be aware of it and not find it odd because decoys were often used for security. The story for the public was an agent was shot. So if anybody not in the know about decoys saw 2 caskets, that was covered too. This is one of the many stories around this event. A suspicious fact that really jumped out at me was that John Liggett, a master Dallas embalmer, called his wife and said, "The president is dead. I have a lot to do." He did not come home for more than 24 hours. And they postulate, now this is just a theory, he easily could have flown with the body in the military coffin and worked on it during the flight to D.C. By the time they got there, his job was done. Came home the next day. He came home in a panic. Well, we hear this. He packed up his family for a high-speed journey to several cities, just sort of an erratic, unplanned trip. He made motel calls from payphones to relatives and other unknown people. His wife could hear having the conversations, couldn't make out who he was talking to, what he was saying, just knew that he was on the phone, hushed calls, frantic. That morning, he saw Jack Ruby shoot Oswald, and his entire demeanor, quote unquote, changed to one of relief. And he said to his wife, "It's okay now," and they went home. He soon had a lot of new money, a new lifestyle, a big fancy luxury home, His daughter later described visits at their house from his dad's freakish friends from New Orleans. A freakish friend, singular, from New Orleans, a guy called David Ferry. That name should ring a bell. Liggett was later involved in an attempted murder and another murder of two different women. One was the widow of LBJ's body double, who was also killed by an unknown person. You just can't make this up. Liggett was shot by a sheriff deputy trying to escape. His ex-wife swore that she had a stare down with him later in a chance meeting in Vegas. Okay, so allegedly he was shot. That was the end of him. But his ex-wife saw him in Vegas, and, they both know they saw each other. LBJ was sworn in before takeoff. Jackie's only regret that she washed her face off before the swearing in for the pictures. After his oath, Johnson was caught winking at a congressman, and it's in a photograph. It was very weird. His wife didn't hide her elation that now that she, this is really interesting, I didn't know this. She was involved in, Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, was involved in a number of financial scandals and was in trouble financially. I didn't pursue what it was about, but it's easy to look up. But as soon as he was sworn in, the heat was off, and she was elated about the whole thing. Jackley's bloodstains, Jackie said, let them see what they've done. The Assassination Records Review Board found documents that there were 2 caskets, coffins, that arrived in Bethesda that day. And a technician inside a building right there where they would land heard 2 different helicopters landing. Enlisted men confirmed the early delivery of a military casket that arrived about 20 minutes before the official casket with Jackie. Hadn't even landed yet. It was delivered by guys in operating room smocks and federal agents with them. It was a simple, unadorned military casket. A bit later, a second ambulance with a fancy casket and Jackie and RFK Sr. and other people came in to the facility, went in, and upstairs. The casket itself didn't get offloaded for quite a while. The second casket. There was a talk of that was the talk of the corpsmen between each other the next day, talking about the 2 caskets. A military honor guard was confused by the conflicting orders of which casket was he supposed to be accompanying and guarding. He was seen racing from the first one in the front of the building and racing with a Secret Service agent to accompany the fancy one. So he was at the wrong casket. So there was a second casket. Multiple eyewitnesses to the bodies arriving before Jackie in a different casket, in a simple shipping casket, was taken to the morgue, and the body was wrapped, lifted out, and they were all told to leave. Multiple eyewitnesses. Multiple confirmations that the body was in a plain coffin, there was no hearse, and Jackie wasn't there. 2 naval doctors did an autopsy, neither being a forensic pathologist. And I am going to stop here because this goes on and on and on and on. It's a long chapter. So I'm going to stop and we'll be back. And the plot's thickening. I hope you're enjoying this. It's a remarkable story. A stain on American history, indeed. So this whole story is what Dorothy Kilgallen is researching and documenting. She got a lot of the information from eyewitnesses and stuff. So we haven't forgotten her, but they really dig deeply into the assassination, and it is interesting. So, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think. If this is the kind of book that you're interested in me covering once in a while, and we'll pursue it again soon. Slán go fóill, slán.